What if the person you trusted most, the one you built a life with, publicly humiliated you at your most vulnerable? For Amelia Ashford, 7 months pregnant and standing by her millionaire husband's side, a glittering charity gala turned into a nightmare. In front of New York's elite, he called her and their unborn child an embarrassment. But what he didn't know was that his trophy wife was about to make a move he never saw coming. She wasn't just going to leave, she was going to take a piece of his empire with her, and what she did with it would ignite a firestorm of scandal, revenge, and a secret that would unravel everything. Stay tuned, because this story is more than just drama. It's a masterclass in quiet power. The penthouse apartment on Park Avenue was a testament to modern opulence, a carefully curated space of glass chrome and minimalist art that screamed wealth with a self-conscious whisper. From the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Manhattan glittered like a carpet of fallen stars, a view that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. This was Amelia Ashford's world, a world she had married into 5 years ago. At 28, she was the beautiful, intelligent, and impeccably dressed wife of Marcus Ashford, the 40-year-old CEO and founder of Innovate Dynamics, a tech giant that had revolutionized data security. To the outside world, they were the golden couple. Marcus, with his sharp suits, sharper jawline, and a reputation for ruthless business acumen, was a titan of industry. Amelia, a former art curator with a quiet grace and a master's degree from Columbia, was the perfect complement to his aggressive ambition. Their life, as documented in the glossy pages of magazines like Vogue and Forbes, was a whirlwind of exclusive parties, international travel, and philanthropic endeavors. They were the picture of success, a modern-day power couple. But pictures, as Amelia knew all too well, could be deceiving. The silence in their sprawling apartment was often heavier than the expensive art on the walls. Marcus was a man who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will, and he expected his home life to operate with the same frictionless efficiency. He wasn't overtly cruel, not in the way that left physical marks. His cruelty was more insidious, a slow erosion of her confidence, a chipping away at her sense of self. It was in the casual dismissal of her opinions, the faint smirk, when she spoke about her passions, the way he'd correct her in front of friends with a patronizing, "What my lovely wife means to say is," he called it, refining her. When they first met, he had been captivated by her spirit and intellect. But once the wedding ring was on her finger, he began the subtle, relentless process of molding her into his ideal accessory. Her friends, he decided, were not of their caliber. Her desire to return to work at a gallery was a cute hobby, but unnecessary. Her wardrobe, her diet, even her laugh were all subject to his unsolicited and often backhanded improvements. The pregnancy had at first seemed like a bridge. Marcus had wanted an heir, a successor to the Ashford dynasty. When Amelia told him she was pregnant, he had been visibly pleased. He had paraded her at events, one hand possessively on the small swell of her stomach, basking in the congratulations. For a few months, a fragile hope bloomed in Amelia's chest. Perhaps a child would soften him, would weave a new, stronger thread into the fraying fabric of their marriage. But as her body changed, so did his attitude. The initial pride curdled into something else. Her morning sickness was an inconvenience to their social schedule. Her fatigue was unattractive, her expanding waistline a source of quiet, constant critique. He would look at her, a flicker of distaste in his eyes, as she struggled to elegantly maneuver her new, heavier body. "Are you sure you should be eating that, darling?" he'd murmur. As she reached for a piece of bread at a dinner party, his voice low and for her ears only, yet the sting was as public as a slap. Tonight was the annual Starlight Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of New York's philanthropic calendar. It was an event Marcus chaired, a night where his generosity was on full display. For Amelia, it was another performance. She stood before the full-length mirror in their cavernous dressing room, the deep sapphire of her custom-made gown clinging to her 7-month pregnant belly. The dress was beautiful, a column of silk that was supposed to make her feel ethereal. Instead, she felt like a ship in full sail, large and conspicuous. Marcus walked in, adjusting his cufflinks, the picture of tailored perfection in his Tom Ford tuxedo. He stopped and stared at her, his gaze clinical evaluative. He didn't say she was beautiful. He didn't tell her she was glowing. "Is that what you're wearing?" he asked, his voice flat. Amelia's hand instinctively went to her stomach. "It's the gown we had fitted last month. You said you liked the color." "I liked the color on the sketch, Amelia. On you. It's a bit much. The whole thing is just a lot." He gestured vaguely at her stomach. "It's very prominent." A familiar coldness seeped into her bones. "I'm 7 months pregnant, Marcus. My stomach is supposed to be prominent." He sighed, a long, exaggerated sound of suffering. "I know that. But must you draw so much attention to it? It's embarrassing. It makes you look ungainly." He walked over his fingers, cool, as they brushed a stray curl from her shoulder. "We're the hosts tonight. All eyes will be on us. I need you to look your best. Composed. Elegant. Not like this." Embarrassing. The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He wasn't just talking about the dress. He was talking about her, about their child, about the physical manifestation of their life together, which he now deemed an unsightly flaw in his perfect public image. A wave of nausea, entirely unrelated to her pregnancy, washed over her. She gripped the edge of her vanity table, her knuckles white. For years, she had swallowed his criticisms, smoothed over his insults, and made excuses for his coldness. She had told herself this was the price of the life she had chosen. She had loved him once, or at least she had loved the man she thought he was. But now, looking at his reflection in the mirror, she saw a stranger, a handsome, polished, and utterly hollow man, who saw his pregnant wife not as a partner, but as a liability to his brand. Something inside her, something she thought had been extinguished long ago, flickered to life. It was a tiny, hot spark of rebellion. She had been a frog in boiling water, the temperature rising so slowly she hadn't realized she was being cooked alive. But tonight, Marcus had cranked the heat all the way up. "It's too late to change, Marcus," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The car is waiting." He gave her one last, disappointed look. "Fine," he clipped. "Just try to stand up straight. And for God's sake, don't hold your stomach like that. It's provincial." As he swept out of the room, leaving the scent of his expensive cologne in his wake, Amelia looked at her reflection again. She saw the hurt in her own eyes, the shimmer of unshed tears. But beneath it, she saw something else, the glint of steel. He thought she was an embarrassment. He thought she was provincial. He had no idea who she really was. He had forgotten that before she was Mrs. Ashford, she was Amelia Sterling, a woman of substance and intellect. A woman who knew the value of art, of history, of a well-played, long game. And he had made one very, very critical mistake, a mistake born of his own arrogance and his complete underestimation of the woman he called his wife. A few years ago, in a rare moment of what she had then mistaken for trust and partnership, he had gifted her a significant block of non-voting shares in Innovate Dynamics. It was a gesture, he had said, to show her that she was a part of his success. The shares were in her name legally and unequivocally hers. At the time, she had been touched. Now she understood the gesture for what it was: a gilded chain, another way to bind her to his world, worthless in terms of control, but valuable enough to ensure her compliance. He thought of it as a bauble. He never imagined she would ever do anything with it. He was wrong. As she picked up her clutch and walked out of the dressing room, a plan began to form in her mind. It was a wild, audacious, and terrifying plan. It would detonate a bomb in the middle of their carefully constructed lives. But for the first time in a long time, Amelia Ashford felt a surge of power. The gala was tonight. The stage was set. Her husband wanted a performance. Oh, she would give him one. And it would be a performance he and all of New York would never forget. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a symphony of crystal gold and the low hum of powerful conversations. Waiters weaved through the throngs of tuxedos and designer gowns, balancing trays of champagne and canapes. Amelia stood by Marcus's side, a placid smile fixed on her face, a mask of serene elegance she had perfected over the years. She nodded, she smiled, she murmured pleasantries to banking moguls and tech billionaires, all while his earlier words, embarrassing, ungainly, provincial, echoed in her mind. His hand was a constant heavy presence on the small of her back, not a gesture of affection, but one of control. He steered her through the crowd like a prized possession, introducing her with a flourish. "You know my wife, Amelia," he would say, his voice booming with false pride. And each time, Amelia would feel a fresh wave of revulsion. She watched him work the room, a master of his universe. He was charming, witty, and exuded an aura of effortless command. He would clap a fellow CEO on the back, share a confidential joke that would elicit booming laughter, his eyes scanning the room, always calculating, always assessing. People were drawn to him, to his power, like moths to a flame. They didn't see the man who had just an hour ago looked at his pregnant wife with undisguised contempt. They saw the visionary, the philanthropist, the generous host. The cracks in their facade, invisible to the glittering assembly, were chasms to Amelia. She remembered a time early in their relationship when his ambition had thrilled her. It had felt like being near the sun, a source of immense energy and light. But she had learned that getting too close to the sun meant getting burned. His ambition was a jealous god, demanding absolute devotion and sacrificing everything and everyone at its altar. Her mind drifted back to a conversation they'd had a few weeks prior. She had been reading a prospectus from a small, non-profit organization, The Haven, which provided legal aid and shelter for women and children escaping domestic abuse. Their work was vital, yet they were perpetually underfunded, operating out of a cramped office in the Bronx. "Marcus," she had said, approaching him in his study, a room paneled in dark wood that always felt cold. "I was thinking about the Foundation's next round of grants. There's this incredible organization, The Haven." He hadn't even looked up from his tablet. "Domestic abuse shelters, Amelia. That's not our brand. It's messy, depressing. Our brand is forward-looking. Technology, education, the arts. Things that are clean, aspirational." "But this is important work," she had pressed. "These women have nowhere else to go. We could make a real difference." He had finally looked at her, then his eyes impatient. "The difference we make is in burnishing the Ashford name, and by extension, the Innovate brand. A 6-figure donation to the Met looks good on the front page of the Times. A donation to a dingy shelter in the Bronx gets a 2-line mention in a local paper if we're lucky. It's about strategic philanthropy, darling, not emotional impulses." The condescension in his tone, the cold, cynical calculus of his charity had laid his character bare. It wasn't about helping people, it was about marketing. It was about using the language of compassion to fuel the engine of his ego, and he assumed with breathtaking arrogance that she was just as shallow. A voice pulled her back to the present. "Amelia, you're absolutely radiant." It was Sophia Dubois, a sharp-witted, silver-haired board member of the Starlight Foundation, and one of the few people in their circle whom Amelia genuinely liked. Sophia's eyes, unlike so many others in the room, held a genuine warmth. "Sophia, thank you. You look wonderful." "Nonsense, I look like a taxidermied flamingo," Sophia quipped with a wry smile. Her eyes flickered to Marcus, who was now deep in conversation with a senator, and then back to Amelia's belly. "He's keeping you busy, I see. It's his big night," Amelia said, the practiced words tasting like ash in her mouth. Sophia's smile softened into something more knowing. "My dear, I've known Marcus for a decade. He's a brilliant man, a force of nature. But forces of nature are best admired from a distance. Living in the eye of the storm, that takes a strength most people don't see." She patted Amelia's arm gently. "You, my dear, have that strength." The quiet acknowledgement of her struggle, the validation from an unexpected quarter, was like a drop of water on parched earth. It fortified the resolve that was hardening in her heart. Sophia saw her. She wasn't just an accessory to someone else's greatness. She was a person of strength in her own right. Later, as they were seated at the head table, the dinner service began. The clinking of cutlery and the murmur of conversation filled the air. Marcus, seated to her right, was in his element holding court, his voice rising slightly above the others, ensuring everyone at the table could hear his pronouncements on the market, on politics, on a new artist he'd discovered. Amelia picked at her food, her appetite gone. She felt a kick, a strong, insistent thump from within. She instinctively placed a hand on her belly, a small, unconscious smile touching her lips. It was a secret conversation, a reminder of the life that was intertwined with hers, a life that was entirely separate from the cold, glittering world Marcus inhabited. Marcus noticed the gesture. He leaned in his breath, warm against her ear, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. "What did I tell you about that? You look like some common farm girl clutching your belly. Have some decorum." The cruelty of it, the sheer pettiness of his remark in this public setting was breathtaking. He could have said anything else. He could have ignored it. But he chose to wound her, to remind her of his disapproval, to assert his control even in this small, intimate moment. The smile fell from her face, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. The last vestiges of her doubt, of her hope that she was misreading him, that their marriage could be salvaged, evaporated. She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the perfectly tailored suit, the expensive watch, the confident smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. And she saw the ugliness beneath it all, the insecurity that masqueraded as arrogance, the fear of being seen as anything less than perfect, a fear so profound that he would lash out at his own pregnant wife to assuage it. He had called her an embarrassment. He had called this life inside her an embarrassment. He had reduced the most profound experience of her life to a branding problem. He had underestimated her, dismissed her, and tonight he had publicly, albeit quietly, humiliated her for the last time. The auction was the centerpiece of the evening, a chance for the city's wealthiest to outdo one another in performative acts of charity. Marcus was the auctioneer, a role he relished. He bounded onto the stage, energized by the spotlight, his voice ringing with theatrical bonhomie. "All right, ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his teeth flashing in the stage lights. "Let's open our hearts and our wallets for the children." He was brilliant at it, Amelia had to admit. He coaxed, he cajoled, he shamed people into bidding higher. He worked the crowd like a maestro, and the numbers climbed into the tens, then hundreds of thousands of dollars for luxury vacations, rare wines, and commissioned portraits. As he was auctioning off a week on a private island, his gaze swept the room and landed on her. Their eyes met. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible wink, a gesture that was supposed to be intimate, a shared moment of triumph. "See what we've accomplished," the wink seemed to say. But all Amelia saw was a man performing for an audience, a man who would return to the privacy of their home and continue to belittle her. She did not smile back. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable, and then deliberately she dropped her eyes to the auction catalogue in her lap. It was a small act of defiance, a refusal to participate in his charade. She felt, rather than saw, his smile falter for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in the perfect performance. The main event was the final item, a direct donation pledge. Marcus would start it off with a significant sum from the Ashford Foundation, encouraging others to match or exceed it. This was his moment, the climax of his evening of self-aggrandizement disguised as altruism. As the auction for the private island wrapped up, Amelia took a slow, deep breath. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She looked across the table at Sophia Dubois, who was watching her with a curious, intelligent gaze. Amelia gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. The stage was set. The audience was rapt. Her husband was in the spotlight, confident, arrogant, and completely oblivious. He thought he was the director of this grand play. He had no idea the lead actress was about to go completely off script. And she wasn't just going to steal the scene. She was going to burn the whole theater down. The applause for Marcus's $1 million pledge was thunderous, a wave of sound that crashed against the ballroom's gilded walls. On the stage, bathed in a warm, adoring spotlight, he was in his element. He stood with his arms slightly outstretched, a benevolent titan accepting the adulation of his court. He was not merely a CEO, he was a conductor, and this room, filled with the city's most powerful people, was his orchestra. He smiled a perfect white, $1 million smile, and Amelia, watching from the head table, felt a sudden, preternatural calm descend upon her. This was the moment. For weeks, a cold, hard knot of rage and despair had been coiled in her stomach, but now it had transmuted into something else entirely: clarity, crystalline and sharp. She watched him preen and felt nothing but a profound, pitying distance. He was a performer playing a role he had written for himself, oblivious to the fact that the play was about to be irrevocably rewritten. Inside her, the baby gave a soft, reassuring kick, a secret pulse of life that was hers, and hers alone. It was the final affirmation. The curtain was about to rise on her own performance. And now, Marcus's voice boomed, milking the moment. The night is young and the needs are great. Who will join the Ashford family in our commitment? Who will be the first to match our pledge for the children? Before a single paddle could be raised, before another voice could break the spell he had cast, Amelia moved. It was a small action, but in the rigid etiquette of the gala, it was a tectonic shift. She pushed her chair back. The quiet scrape of its legs on the polished marble floor was like a crack of thunder in the expectant hush. A ripple of confusion went through the head table. Heads turned. A low murmur spread like wildfire through the room, as hundreds of pairs of eyes swiveled from the man on the stage to the pregnant wife who was now impossibly rising to her feet. The ambient noise of the ballroom, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of silk, the low hum of conversation died instantly. A vacuum of silence formed around her. On stage, Marcus froze. His smile faltered, twitching at the corners. For a split second, a flicker of pure, unadulterated annoyance crossed his face. What was she doing? This was his moment. She was the beautiful silent prop. Her role was to sit, to smile, to applaud, not to stand, never to stand. He recovered quickly, his years of media training kicking in. He turned the full force of his charm on her, his voice dripping with a feigned, indulgent affection that was meant to gently push her back into her seat. "Ah!" He chuckled into the microphone, the sound echoing unnaturally in the silent room. "It seems my wonderful, generous wife wants to add to our family's contribution, always thinking of the children. How generous of you, darling. We can discuss the details later." The word darling was a silken threat. "Sit down. Now." But Amelia did not sit down. She didn't even look at him. She took a single deliberate step away from the table into the open space, ensuring everyone could see her. She drew herself up to her full height, her hand resting not in supplication, but in a gesture of serene ownership on the curve of her belly. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it was so clear and steady that it carried to the farthest corners of the room. "If I may," she said, her eyes sweeping over the astonished faces of New York's elite. "I would also like to make a pledge tonight." She then turned her gaze to her husband. The look in her eyes was one he had never seen before. Gone was the gentle, accommodating wife he took for granted. In her place was a woman of unnerving composure, a stranger who looked at him not with adoration, but with a cool, clinical assessment. "Actually, Marcus," she said, her voice ringing with a quiet authority that belied her interruption. "This is a personal donation, not from the Ashford Foundation. This donation is from me." The tension in the room ratcheted up to an almost unbearable degree. Personal donation. The pledges here were from corporate coffers and family trusts, abstract entities of immense wealth. A personal donation on this scale was a different beast entirely. It was intimate, it was bold, it was unheard of. Marcus's face, projected onto the giant screens flanking the stage, was a mask of tightening fury. "Amelia," he said, his voice now low and tight, a barely concealed growl, "this is neither the time nor the place for this discussion. Sit down." "On the contrary," Amelia replied, her composure unshakable. She turned back to the audience, seizing control of the narrative. "I believe this is the perfect time and the perfect place, because philanthropy at its heart should be personal." She paused, letting the room hang on her words. "My husband is a visionary," she began the statement, so unexpected it made Marcus blink. "He has built an empire, innovate dynamics from the ground up. And in our years together, he has taught me a great deal about value. He taught me about assets, about portfolios, and about the importance of strategic allocation. He taught me that some assets are perceived as merely decorative, holding no real power, when in fact their true value lies in being utterly and completely underestimated." A dangerous, knowing light danced in her eyes. On stage, Marcus's unease was palpable. This was not an emotional whim. This was calculated. This was a speech. He had a sickening feeling that he was no longer the director of this show. A few years ago, Amelia continued, her voice even. In a characteristically grand gesture, my husband gifted me a portfolio of non-voting shares in Innovate Dynamics. It was a wedding anniversary gift. To make you feel a part of it all, he'd said, with all the condescension of a man giving a child a shiny new toy. He considered it a bauble, a gilded chain, an asset with no teeth. The color began to drain from Marcus's face. He finally saw the abyss that was opening up at his feet. His lawyers had structured that gift. It was hers, legally, irrevocably. And while these shares don't grant me a voice in the boardroom, Amelia's voice grew stronger, imbued with a power she hadn't realized she possessed. They are nonetheless an asset of considerable value, an asset that is legally, unequivocally, and entirely mine. She let that statement settle. The whispers in the room were now audible. People were doing the math. They knew what Innovate stock was worth. My husband speaks of on-brand charity, of clean, aspirational giving. And I have come to realize that he is right. It is essential to invest in the things you truly deeply believe in, to align your assets with your core values. She took a deep breath, the final moment of calm before she detonated the bomb she had so carefully constructed. Her eyes found his, and she held his gaze, a judge delivering a sentence. Tonight, just before we arrived, my husband informed me that my pregnancy, this child, she laid her hand firmly on her stomach, a gesture of pure defiance, was an embarrassment. A collective audible gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a raw, shocking sound, the sound of a carefully constructed facade being ripped down to reveal the ugliness beneath. In a single sentence, Amelia had transformed a domestic dispute into a public execution. People looked from her standing proud and defiant to the man on the stage whose face was now a ghastly shade of white. The humiliation was absolute, radiating from him in palpable waves. He finds my changing body ungainly. Amelia's voice quivered not with weakness, but with the force of her long-suppressed rage. He believes this miracle of life detracts from the polished brand he so carefully cultivates. He is, of course, entitled to his opinion on what constitutes an embarrassment. She let the condemnation hang in the air for a moment longer before continuing. But I have a different opinion. I believe that true embarrassment is cruelty. I believe the only thing that is truly ungainly is a lack of compassion. And I believe that the most important foundation we can ever build is a safe and loving one for a child. For any child. Her gaze left her husband's and swept the room until it landed on a small table in the back corner. There sat Maria Sanchez, the director of the Haven, who had been invited by Sophia Dubois and who now looked on with an expression of stunned disbelief. That is why tonight I will not be donating to the Starlight Foundation. Amelia announced, each word a hammer blow. Another wave of shock rippled through the room. Instead, I am pledging the entirety of my personal assets, my complete portfolio of Innovate Dynamics shares, currently valued at $94 million, to an organization that I believe in. An organization that works in the trenches. An organization that does the messy, vital, life-saving work that is never on brand. She looked directly at the woman from the Bronx. I will be transferring the full amount to the Haven, a shelter and legal aid foundation for women and children escaping domestic abuse. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so profound it felt as if the entire city had fallen quiet. $94 million. to a small, unknown shelter. It was an act of such magnificent, breathtaking rebellion that it short-circuited the minds of everyone present. Then, a single sound broke the stillness, a slow, deliberate clap. It came from the head table. Sophia Dubois was on her feet, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated triumph, her hands coming together in a powerful, rhythmic beat. A moment later, someone else stood, then another. A smattering of applause became a ripple, then a wave, then a deafening, rolling roar of a standing ovation that shook the crystal chandeliers. They were not just clapping for the money. They were clapping for the sheer glorious audacity of the act, for the woman who had turned her pain into power and her humiliation into a weapon of mass creation. On stage, Marcus Ashford stood alone, trapped in the unforgiving glare of the spotlight he had so coveted. It no longer felt warm. It felt scorching, stripping him bare, exposing his smallness, his cruelty, his utter defeat. He was a king, dethroned in his own court by the one person he never even considered a player in the game. Amelia's eyes welled, and a single tear finally escaped, tracing a hot path of liberation down her cheek. She gave a small, affirming nod to the weeping, overwhelmed director of the Haven. Then, without a single backward glance at the man she was leaving in the ruins, Amelia Ashford turned. The crowd parted for her, a sea of stunned, admiring faces. With a grace and dignity that was the ultimate rebuke to his insults, she walked out of the ballroom, her head held high, leaving the thunderous applause behind her as she stepped out into the cool night air, a free woman. The silence in the back of the town car was a universe. As the vehicle glided away from the shimmering lights of the pier, leaving behind the epicenter of her old life, Amelia felt as though she was suspended between two worlds. Behind her lay the smoldering ruins of her marriage, a public detonation of her own design. Ahead lay a terrifying, formless void. The adrenaline that had encased her in a shell of icy calm during her speech began to recede, and in its place, a violent tremor started in her hands, spreading through her entire body. She wrapped her arms around herself, her hand instinctively cupping her belly, not as a gesture of provincialism, but as an anchor in the storm she had unleashed. Every traffic light they passed was a flashbulb, illuminating the magnitude of what she had done. $94 million. The Haven. Embarrassment. The words echoed in the silent car, a chaotic symphony of rebellion and consequence. She hadn't just left her husband. She had publicly gutted him, using the very tenets of his world-value assets' strategic allocation as her weapons. Her phone, a sleek device Marcus had insisted she carry, began to vibrate incessantly in her clutch. A relentless angry buzzing. News alerts, texts, missed calls. It was the sound of her old world trying to pull her back, to scream at her, to demand an explanation. With a final, decisive movement, she opened the clutch, powered the phone down, and plunged the car into a profound, welcome silence. She was going dark. The destination was not a friend's penthouse or a sister's suburban home. Marcus would anticipate those moves, his reach long enough to poison any well of support. The car pulled up to a discreet, pre-war building in Brooklyn Heights, its elegant but unassuming facade blending seamlessly into the quiet, tree-lined street. A man in a simple dark suit, unremarkable in every way, was waiting. He didn't speak her name. He simply nodded and said, "This way, ma'am." He was from the private security firm Daniel Peterson had on retainer. The apartment was on the 3rd floor. It was spacious, clean, and utterly anonymous. The furniture was tasteful, but devoid of personality, the walls bare. It smelled of fresh paint and nothing else. After the opulent curated world of Park Avenue, a space so saturated with Marcus's taste that she could barely breathe, this anonymity felt like a lungful of pure, clean oxygen. It was a blank slate. Her blank slate, as the security man quietly closed the door behind her, leaving her utterly alone. For the first time in years, the full weight of her actions crashed down. She slid down the wall, her sapphire gown pooling around her, and finally let the tears come. They were tears of terror, of grief for the life she had once thought she wanted, and of a fierce, terrifying exhilaration. She had jumped from the gilded cage. Now she just had to learn how to fly. Meanwhile, back in the penthouse, Marcus Ashford was experiencing the fallout in real time. He had stormed out of the gala, leaving his PR team to handle the stunned press, his face a mask of such volcanic fury that people physically recoiled from him. He swept into his apartment, the door slamming shut like a thunderclap, and the carefully controlled facade of the CEO shattered. With a guttural roar of rage, he seized a heavy Lalique crystal sculpture from its pedestal, one Amelia had particularly loved, and hurled it against the wall where it exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. He paced the vast living room like a caged panther, his tuxedo jacket discarded and his bow tie ripped from his neck. His phone was a conduit of pure chaos. His lead counsel, Robert Sterling, a bulldog of a lawyer whose fees were astronomical, was shouting. His head of PR, a woman named Janice, was in hysterics. Board members were texting with escalating panic. "What do you mean you can't block it?" Marcus snarled into his phone at Sterling. "They're my shares. It was a gift, a bauble. You can't just give away $94 million because you're having a hormonal fit." "It's not that simple, Marcus." Sterling's voice was tight with strain. "The shares were legally transferred to her name. No strings attached. It's her asset. Gifting it is her prerogative." "Then find a string," Marcus bellowed, his voice hoarse. "This is a public declaration of war. I want her crushed. I want her penniless. I want her to come crawling back here begging for my forgiveness. She is mentally unstable, a danger to herself and my child. Use that." That became the strategy. By dawn, the first legal salvo was fired. The emergency injunction filed by Sterling's firm was a masterpiece of legal gaslighting. It didn't focus on the money, it focused on Amelia. It painted a portrait of a beloved wife suffering from profound emotional distress due to her delicate condition. It spoke of Marcus's deep concern for her irrational behavior and his fiduciary duty as her husband to protect their family's assets from her impulsive actions. It requested the court to freeze the transfer and order a full psychiatric evaluation of Amelia Ashford. It was a brutal, condescending, and classic move. If you can't win the argument, discredit the person making it. The media, hungry for a new angle, latched onto it. The narrative began to fracture. Was Amelia a feminist hero or a hysterical pregnant woman? Concerned husband angle, pushed by a PR firm on a multi-million-dollar retainer, began to gain traction in more conservative outlets. Amelia woke up on a nondescript sofa to the blare of a news report on the television she'd finally turned on. She saw her own face, a candid photo from a happier time, next to headlines questioning her sanity. The words "emotionally distressed" and "psychiatric evaluation" felt like physical blows. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Could he do that? Could he use their child, her own body, against her to prove she was insane? Her hands trembled as she dialed the number for Daniel Peterson. When he answered, his voice was the epitome of calm. "I see you've seen the morning news," he said dryly. "Try not to let it concern you. It's exactly what we predicted." "They're saying I'm crazy, Daniel. They want to force me into an evaluation." "They can request whatever they like," Daniel said, his tone reassuringly steady. "It's a scare tactic, Amelia, a public performance designed to intimidate you into submission. And we have the counter-performance ready to go." Within hours, Daniel's office responded. First, they filed the affidavit from Dr. Hansen, a respected and unimpeachable obstetrician who stated that Amelia was a model of mental and emotional fortitude under significant stress, and that her decisions were lucid, considered, and rational. But the second filing was the real bombshell. It was the sworn affidavit from Clara Bennett Marcus's former executive assistant. In spare, devastating detail, it chronicled a year of unsolicited late-night texts from Marcus, of inappropriate comments about her appearance of being passed over for a promotion after she politely declined his invitation for a private drink to discuss her career trajectory. It ended with her termination due to performance issues 2 weeks later. The document didn't just support Amelia's claim, it established a clear predatory pattern. Marcus wasn't a concerned husband, he was a serial emotional abuser. This changed the game. The story was no longer just about a marital spat. It was about power dynamics, workplace harassment, and the silencing of women. And that's when Maria Sanchez, the director of the Haven, stepped onto the battlefield. Maria was not a woman to be trifled with. A Bronx native with a fire in her eyes and a spine of steel, she saw the injunction not as a legal hurdle, but as a declaration of war against every woman her shelter had ever served. She didn't wait for the courts, she launched a campaign. On the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by cameras, she gave a speech that became legendary. "Marcus Ashford's lawyers say Amelia Ashford is irrational," Maria said, her voice ringing with righteous anger. "They say she is distressed. I ask you this, what is more rational than taking an instrument of your oppression and turning it into a tool of liberation for thousands of women? What is more rational than deciding that a safe bed for a mother and her child is worth more than a new yacht? They call her hysterical. We call her a hero." She announced the "I am not an embarrassment" campaign. It was grassroots genius. Women from all walks of life began posting photos of their pregnant bellies, their C-section scars, their stretch marks, their children. They shared stories of being shamed, dismissed, and underestimated. The hashtag exploded. The Haven's website, once a simple information portal, crashed from the traffic and donations that poured in from all over the world. Marcus Ashford had tried to make this a private fight about one hysterical woman. Maria Sanchez had turned it into a global movement. Innovate Dynamics' stock, which had already been shaken, began a serious decline. The brand, once associated with cutting-edge security, was now synonymous with public scandal and misogyny. This is what finally got the board's attention. Sophia Dubois watched it all unfold with a grim satisfaction. She called a lunch with George Caldwell, a staunchly conservative, numbers-obsessed board member who respected Marcus and distrusted emotion. Over lobster salad at a private club where women had only been allowed as members for 15 years, she made her case. "The numbers are troubling, George," she began, pushing a tablet across the table, showing the stock's trajectory. "This isn't a blip, it's a trend. The sentiment analysis is a disaster. We're losing ground with female consumers. and 3 top female engineers in the AI division have quit in the last week. It's a marital squabble, George grumbled. He'll handle it. He always does. He's not handling it, Sophia said coolly. He's fanning the flames. His ego is preventing him from seeing the long-term damage. This isn't about his wife anymore. It's about his judgment. A CEO who calls his own unborn child an embarrassment has a problem with optics at the very least. At worst, it shows a profound lack of foresight. This is a liability. By framing her moral outrage in the cold, hard language of finance and risk management, she was speaking George's language. She saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The seed was planted. The final act took place in a sterile, airless conference room for Marcus's deposition. Daniel Peterson was the picture of calm, his questions beginning with the mundane. He asked about Innovate's founding, its early successes. Then he pivoted to Amelia. Mr. Ashford, what was your wife's profession when you met? She was in the art world. A curator, Marcus said the word, dripping with condescension. A highly respected one, I understand, with a postgraduate degree from an Ivy League institution. She was good at her little hobby, yes. Marcus smirked. And during your marriage, did you feel that hobby was something she should continue? Her primary role was to be my wife, Marcus stated, puffing out his chest. To manage our homes, our social life. To be a partner to me. It was a demanding position. So you saw it as a job, her being your wife? Daniel asked softly. An important one. One that made her own career ambitions redundant. Marcus was so wrapped in his own arrogance, he didn't see the trap closing around him. Daniel let the silence hang for a moment before he slid a document across the table. Exhibit A, Mr. Ashford. Your prenuptial agreement. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Your own lawyers at Sterling's firm drafted it. Marcus glanced at it, annoyed. It's standard. It protects my assets. She signed it. She did, Daniel agreed, and it contains a very generous non-disclosure agreement. In exchange for her silence, she receives a one-time payment. But your excellent lawyers were very thorough, weren't they? They thought of every eventuality. Could you please turn to page 14, paragraph 7, section C? It's titled the Reputational Harm Clause. Most people call it a bad actor clause. Marcus's lawyer, Robert Sterling, suddenly sat bolt upright. He knew the clause. It was boilerplate designed to protect a high-profile client from a spouse who might, for example, sell a lurid story to the tabloids. It had never occurred to him it could be used in reverse. Daniel read it aloud, his voice even. In the event that one party commits an act of egregious public humiliation or intentional emotional cruelty against the other, as attested to by a minimum of 3 non-related witnesses, the non-disclosure agreement is rendered null and void, and all settlement terms are subject to renegotiation. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes locking with Marcus's for the first time. Mr. Ashford, on the night of the gala, you stood on a stage in front of over 400 people, and just before that, you told your pregnant wife she was an embarrassment. Would you say that constitutes egregious public humiliation? The color drained from Marcus's face. The smirk, the confidence, the arrogance, it all evaporated, leaving behind the stark naked panic of a king who has just realized he's been checkmated. He looked at the document, at the words his own hubris had put there, a self-laid trap he had swaggered right into. He looked at his lawyer, who could offer no defense. He had been so focused on Amelia's emotional state, he never once considered his own actions. The leaked deposition was the final nail in the coffin. The board, armed with Sophia's data and George Caldwell's newfound pragmatism, convened an emergency meeting. Marcus walked in, expecting a strategy session. He found an execution. They didn't even let him sit down. Sophia, as the most tenured member, delivered the verdict. He was to resign, effective immediately, or be fired for cause, citing the reputational damage and the gross lapse in judgment proven by his own words in the deposition. Stripped of his title, his reputation in ruins, and his greatest legal shield shattered, Marcus had no fight left. The court approved the share transfer. The Haven became a powerhouse for change. And Amelia, free and clear, negotiated a divorce settlement that recognized her not as a discarded accessory, but as a wronged partner who had played the game better than its master. Her victory wasn't just a win. It was a hostile takeover of her own life. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a scorned wife's revenge. It was a story about the deceptive nature of power and the quiet strength of those who are underestimated. Amelia Ashford didn't just walk away from a toxic marriage. She ignited a movement, funded a revolution, and reclaimed her own narrative in the most spectacular way possible. She reminded us that the most powerful assets we have are our integrity, our courage, and our voice. Marcus Ashford lost his company, his reputation, and his wife, all because he failed to see the woman standing right next to him. What did you think of Amelia's incredible move? Was it an act of pure genius or righteous revenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you were inspired by this story of strength and strategy, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe
that wraps up today's
for
story.
more true life
Now we want to hear
dramas.
from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.